Next up, we have two of my favourite people. They are fantastic, absolutely brilliant at what they do. Their names are Dr. Bianca Frost and Cameron Hodkinson. And I have had the pleasure of working with both of these, and you are going to learn so much about creative storytelling in this session. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking and I will hand over to the wonderful Dr. Bianca Frost and Cameron Hodkinson. Welcome to Learning Conference.
Hello, everyone out there in virtual land.
Hey guys, how are you going?
Hi. Yes, so my name is Bianca. I'm a senior educational developer at Deakin University. I've been working in digital learning for 13 years. You may have seen my bio, so I won't go on about it. And this is my colleague, or former colleague, and great friend and mentor, and someone I bounce lots of ideas off, Cameron.
Hi guys, I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, but at the moment I'm a practicing product designer, and I've worked with Bianca a number of times throughout the years, particularly in e-learning, but with a real focus on storytelling, and we're pretty excited about what we're going to share with you today. So.
Yeah, and I think the format for today is maybe a little bit different from the other sessions you've previously had. We're just going to be having a general conversation. You guys can be flies on the wall to listen to Cam and I bounce our ideas off and on one another, and ask questions as you go. So
we'll be pausing intermittently to pick up on those questions. So if there's something that we're covering at a particular juncture, throw those questions into the chat window, and we'll pause for a break to see if we can answer them, and if not, maybe we'll distract you with with some dogs and cats, and we'll keep moving on.
And if there's no questions, we'll just keep talking.
Yeah, pretty easy to do.
Yeah. So I think maybe to get started, Cam, over to you.
Great. So look, we're talking a little bit about storytelling, and Bianca and I have been working together in the learning industry for a long time, telling stories and building, story-based learning that really tries to do more than just convey a little bit of information. And as we were planning for this session a couple of weeks ago, we had a conversation, and it wandered far and wide into the depths of the things that we've been doing. And afterwards, I sat down and watched a couple of mind-bending episodes of Dark. If you haven't checked it out on Netflix, please go and check it out. It's amazing. But so after that, it was getting pretty late, and my wife and I just wanted something to relax to and let our minds go. So we started channel surfing, and the temptation was there to jump on House Hunters International and vicariously look at where we can't go at the moment in lockdown. But we landed on Seinfeld, and the particular episode that we hit on, George was sitting in a car driving along with his girlfriend Marcy, and they're just having a general conversation, and Marcy says, so I'm on 3rd Avenue, minding my own business, and yada, yada, yada. Next thing I know it, I get a free massage and a facial. And George looks over at her, impressed, and says, what a succinct story. And as the episode goes on, this use of yada, 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 this contraction of stories just begins to wear on all of the characters and the audience. And it got me thinking, it really highlights that, Seinfeld as a show, a self-proclaimed show about nothing, that is always about something. It managed to take something and reduce it down to nothing. But more importantly, it left us all hanging. It left us craving the detail, craving the story, and highlighted to me something that is talked about a lot in a book that I love, The Storytelling Animal by Jonathan Gottschall, that as a species, we are hooked and addicted to story. It's how we understand the world and how we interact with one another, how we remember things. And when we're asleep, we tell ourselves stories. So it's a really interesting premise, and I think one that's vastly important in learning design, because at the end of the day, education has kind of been built on these foundations of passing knowledge through story. And so we wanted to start with this I suppose, broad idea that, you know, as humans, we can't get enough of story. And I think that the streaming content that you see flying around the place these days is a testament to that. But when it comes to bringing that into a learning context, that yada, yada, yada approach is quite often one that we see more often than not.
Cam, it's
Yes.
often the yada, yada, yada in a lot of digital learning is really just blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Because you start with something, you've got to like do this like piece of learning, and you just work through a whole heap of information and the end.
Yeah.
So yada, yada, yada is this complete story that's missing in the middle.
Yeah. And I think, you know, we have all of these constraints, budget constraints and client constraints and, you know, business project management constraints that overlay over what we do, you know. So as a creative profession, we're always being told to cut corners. And I think, unfortunately, one of the things that typically suffers first is the juicy detail of a story that is the hook. You know, it's the thing that gets me excited and Bianca excited, and I think most people actually, but it's sort of often seen as fluff, I suppose. So, you know, it does get extracted out.
Yeah, and I think, I suppose the purpose of this session is, we heard Aaron in his fabulous like keynote this morning talking about you know, maybe different models of learning that are performance oriented, and that it's less about content and more about tools, just in time, all that sort of stuff. But there's some aspects of learning which are actually really, any learning is well suited to storytelling, but some more so than others. If it's performance based, yes, well, maybe tools and are more efficient and effective, just in time. But it's the story that, particularly for things that, particularly if we're talking about adult education and training, and I've come from a private sector background, working with vendors and not-for-profits and government, which is very, very different to where I am now, which is in the tertiary sector. But the main difference is that the motivation to learn in a lot of, you know, corporate training and education is extrinsic. You have to do this learning. You have to, you know, be compliant with this or that. Oh, you need to know what to do in this situation. And how do you motivate people? It's like they're not really interested. So it's like click next, click next, click next, get through, select and reveal. You know, you get somewhere to the end, and basically all you've done in the middle is yada, yada, blah, blah, blah. So if your learners are not intrinsically motivated, as they tend to be more so in the tertiary sector, where they've, you know, paid money to invest, you know, a lot of money to invest in their education, how can you get them interested? How can you get that behavioural change or that performance outcome that you're actually seeking? And I think this is the power of story. It's incredibly, it enables us to empathise and to emote, and provides us frameworks that are familiar from our own experiences that we can draw on to actually remember larger concepts. It might not be about, you know, the dot list of specific, you know, steps you need to take to do something, whether it's OH&S, you know, how to bend your knees and lift at something. But how do you get people to care about that? Oh yeah, no, I'm supposed to do that, but why, you know, why should I do it? Why don't I do it? But a story like, you know, perhaps that, you know, talks about the consequences and the outcomes and what that means for someone, and you can get those learners to emote with it and engage them in that story, then it's something they'll remember long beyond the actual, you know, seat time itself. So I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the you know, one of the key things about story is that it engages people into ideas and emotions and situations that they ordinarily wouldn't be exposed to, but they're in a safe enough environment that they can be exposed to those. And quite often that might be empathizing, you know, with a particular character, or, you know, understanding a particular point of view. And I think particularly when you're dealing with emotive or attitudinal behavioral learning, where, you know, the underlying aspects of what needs to happen in a workplace are actually up to the employees. The power of story can really be a great motivator. And we saw that, years ago when Bianca and I both worked on a project called the Safe Files, trying to turn compliance training on its head and away from those bullet lists of, laws. These are the things that you have to do in the workplace, to being, these are the stories of what happens when you don't do these things. Really started to steer that ship away from, what was probably incredibly boring, but also ineffective training, to something that is far more motive. And here in Victoria, you can see that the government doing the same thing with the COVID-19 response, and trying to capture some of that empathy and through stories, so that people can put themselves in other shoes and actually understand why these things are important.
I think it's a good point. I don't want to dwell on this, Cam, because I know we have to keep moving forward.
Yeah.
But so one of the projects we worked on was a suite of compliance modules in partnership with a law firm, and so often compliance is just it's tick the boxes. Yep, just tick the boxes, get it done. But what was so unique about that is we used a lot of this the techniques we're going to talk about for the rest of this session, but using that storytelling approach, starting from a place of empathy, thinking about the outcomes. We wanted people to feel the story, so it made it meaningful. So it gave them the impetus to actually rethink their behaviours in the workplace and why it was important to not bully someone or not to harass someone. And I think the standout thing for that was presented as a graphic narrative, but there was that great feedback that one of our staff members was at a barbecue, and someone just at the barbecue started talking about, oh my God, I did this training thing, this graphic narrative online. And in their own free time, they were recounting the story. So they remembered that. I mean, when I think about so much of the compliance training I've done, which is just information, checklist, and I get to the end of it, yada, blah, 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 remember absolutely nothing. So I think that shows the potential of story.
Yeah.
People could actually take that away into their own personal lives and feel like it was compelling enough to actually recount to other people.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Hannah, we might pause there and just see if there's any questions so far that the audience have before we sort of shift gears a little bit.
Sounds great. Really insightful conversation, Cameron and Bianca. So thank you so much for being here today. We've got a question some questions from the audience. We've got a question from Emma. She wants to know, do you have any tips for writing effective stories? Do we need formal qualifications?
No, you don't need formal qualifications. And yes, the rest of this presentation is tips on how to write great stories.
Yeah.
With a little bit of homework. So lucky you guys.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, some constructive exercises. Yeah. So, I suppose just moving on. Thank you for that question. So, really, we kind of started saying what storytelling is and isn't. And we'll move more into that. We're going to focus on narrative as a pedagogy, and by looking at some storytelling frameworks. We're also going to look at how to use story-based methodologies in a completely different context, not just in terms of content and delivery, but also in actually how you plan and design for better learning outcomes and processes. And Cam particularly is going to speak about that. And then we want to spend the bulk of the session talking about really sort of concrete strategies that you can use and play around with, as long as what Cam's calling homework, because he was a teacher, so he can't help himself.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
But just some things that you can actually play around with, that you can apply to build your own understanding and use in your own learning. So I think we should maybe move on. Yeah.
Hannah, was there any other questions before we do that?
It'd be really great to know what emotion is strongest when storytelling.
It depends on the story. I mean, it really depends on the story and the person and their experiences. But I would encourage you to get we've got this slide pack and some resources with links that we'll distribute after the session. But a book called The Storytelling Animal by an author, Jonathan Gottschall. He's done a lot of research into storytelling, and he dives into a lot of studies, scientific studies that have been done in the US and Europe about people's how people believe stories when they're from particular sources, how they feel after particular stories. And it's a really interesting deep dive into how stories interact with the human mind, and what they can achieve and do.
I'll just add to that, and sort of more specifically through an example. I think the emotion you want to evoke depends on what the outcome you want to be. So one of my recent sort of Deacon MOOC courses, it was, kind of dry course about caring for older people, partnership-centered care. How do we actually care about old people when they go into a home, and how do we understand their point of view and perspective? And I did that through a 3-part story based on an old man who had this, rich, fulfilling life. He's got to a certain point in time. His wife's dead. He's been put into an aged care home, and he's been separated from his dog, Jetsam. And it's a 3-part story, but it really pulls on the heartstring. And in the comments, we constantly get people saying, my God, that brought a tear to my eye. And so the power there is it's empathy. I really think, I think empathy is probably a word we're going to hear a lot throughout this learning design conference when we talk about human-centered design or design thinking or anything else. But yeah, it's empathizing with the story or the character and identification with them. Like, I can either understand this because this, this story I'm reading or I'm watching or I'm hearing about could be me, or it could be someone I know or someone I could love. And if it's workplace compliance, I don't want that to happen to them. So therefore I've got a care factor. So maybe I'll change my behavior and think about things differently when I go about them in the future. But the emotion when it provoked can be quite different. I mean, it could be humorous or, it really depends on the context.
It comes back to relatability as well. Can you imagine yourself in those situations? And do you see yourself in the characters? I mean, some of what we'll talk about is this idea of a monomyth, or kind of overarching stories that are actually all stories. And when you start to dig into the detail and do some analysis on the films we watch and the TV shows, they're not so dissimilar. We see ourselves in those characters, and that's why we like a show more or less, and quite often why we gravitate towards.
You identify with a particular character. You say, oh my God, I don't know, I'm just going to say The Notebook. Maybe not The Notebook, but maybe you identify with, Love Unrequited. I mean, we always relate things back to ourselves, and I suppose that's the power of constructivism. If you want to talk about pedagogy within story. So maybe we should keep going, Cam.
I think so. Yeah, we're losing time.
Yeah, I was
very quickly.
I think another thing to talk about is there's different types of story. Sometimes it's bandied about in learning. Oh yeah, we're storytelling, and it's all exciting. But I think sometimes there's misnomers or misunderstandings about what we mean. I think what we're going to focus on in this conversation is narrative-based learning. And I want to differentiate that, I think, Cam, between scenario-based learning, which is kind of like basically setting up a hypothetical or real situation and asking people to reflect and respond to that setup, versus something like case study, which is also a story, but it's a factual demonstration of something that existed, and you can do the same thing. But narrative itself is the king of story. It has everything. It has the beginning, it has the middle, it has the end. There's no yada yada, there's no blah, blah, blah. Everything in there is meaningful, and it's there for a purpose that can be connected to some kind of behavioural, attitudinal or performance-based outcome. So when thinking about, this move, and that's not what we're going to focus on, because I don't consider that to be true creative storytelling. They're like little devices that are used and sometimes, misunderstood as narrative. But I think narrative, the real key benefits of that is that it, in its richest form, it imparts information, knowledge and experience from another point of view. It's intrinsically woven, so it's not we talk about in creative writing, show and not tell. Show is the exposition. It's just presenting facts, or it's just presenting information. And that is often what we see in more traditional forms of like digital learning, as opposed to a dramatization or a reimagining of something that, more truly deeply engages people on that, emotive level. So yeah, it's immersive. Also, a really key benefit for learning design is that you follow some of the storytelling frameworks that we'll talk about, and it intrinsically scaffolds the learning. You tell your story, and you can actually map all the little bits of stuff you want people to know or want people to be able to do in the story itself. So when you're doing your design mapping or however you do it, and we've also sort of covered that that strongest emotion you want to engage is empathy. Someone needs to be able to empathize with a character, or anti-empathize if they're an antagonist. So
yeah, and obviously that's not always going to be necessary. It depends on the outcomes and the sorts of things that you're trying to solve, the performance issues that you're trying to solve in the workplace. But quite often, as we discovered when we started to do research for the save files into occupational health and safety, some of the biggest findings into disasters globally have highlighted that it's attitudinal issues. It has absolutely nothing to do with any of the mechanics of doing a job. It's actually the individual's attitudes. So definitely worth.
And that's, I think, a great place to think about using storytelling, is that we're trying to change people, not we're training people, not machines. If it's just a strict process, then maybe storytelling is not the thing to use. But maybe moving forward, we can just look at some basic storytelling frameworks.
Yeah. Let me.
Cam, I'm not sure if you want to share our.
I am sharing it now.
I was actually going to start with so a story. Cam, you've got this here from your favourite author.
Yes. One of, yeah. So from The Storytelling Animal, Jonathan Gottschall, it was one of my favourite quotes that it condenses down the idea, the mechanics of a story into these simple equation. Story equals a character plus a predicament plus attempted extraction. And no matter how simple or complex that story is, those arcs that they follow can all kind of link back to this really simple equation. And I think it's a really great starting point for where we're going to launch into. Next, we're going to start talking about frameworks that build around this and help you to structure what those characters face in terms of predicaments and how they attempt to extract themselves out.
So I think that ties nicely into this idea of like the 3-act structure, which is basically the essence of any story. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and an end. And for learning designers, you want to think about analytically. It's about defining, analysing, and applying a solution. This 3-act structure can be applied to anything, and it's different from just information, yada yada, end. It actually it's an arc for a reason, because there you've got rising action, you've got a situation, you've got your rising action. So your situation may start with the character. Your rising action, that's your conflict, and then there's a resolution or a solution to it, and that's your denouement. There might be other ways you might be familiar with. Sometimes this is referred to as Freytag's pyramid of rising action, but it's all the same thing. It's a beginning and a middle and end, where you start somewhere, something happens, and you've got to work it out, and then you come to your resolution or conclusion.
Hi, Bianca. I've just got the audience is talking about, they'd love to hear about case studies or projects that you've worked on that sort of demonstrates what you've been speaking about.
Case studies. Well, yeah, case studies.
Do you mean case studies, Hannah? Do you mean case studies for applying what we're talking about, or case studies as a narrative mechanism?
Like an example of this process
Yes.
that you're talking about in real life would be great.
Okay. B, why don't we talk about the reverse chronology when we get to it for the save files? It's probably a good structure to unpack.
Yeah, look, let's come back to case studies. I think we'll do that in the end. And I'm just conscious of time, so I think we need to move through this section quite quickly.
Yeah.
But we'll come back to that, I think, towards the last section. So yeah, so understanding this 3-act structure, you just think beginning, middle, and end. The other thing you might have heard about is the hero's journey, which is often used, but we're probably suggesting you simplify that for learning design purposes. But when you're thinking about narrative, there's other basic structures you can use. So when presenting your narrative, you can present it in sections, which is an episodic one. But each little story that you're telling within that timeline still follows the 3-act structure. Other narratives, and a great example of episodic narrative is like TV soap operas. They're all like little contained episodes where they have a start, they have the rising action, they have a cliffhanger, and then they start again. And that's a device that can be used. Other devices are polyphonic or converging narratives, where this can happen 2 ways. You can have multiple points of view honing in on an incident. So if you were talking about compliance training and it was, someone, didn't wear their PPE gear in a COVID situation, that's the event. How did all the different characters come to that and, possibly interact with the event? Or alternatively, you start with the event and, speak outwards. So it becomes like a spoke of different stories. Circular narratives are, Alice in Wonderland's a classic example. She starts somewhere, all these little things happen to her along the line. So, that's your narrative arc, and it comes back to the beginning, and the character can reflect on that. I think one of the really interesting things that can completely transform any kind of story you're telling, no matter what it is playing around with chronologies. Often, like in e-learning or digital learning, we see a linear thing. We start here and in chronological order go A, B, C, D, E, and get to an end point. Other more complex narratives might involve a non-linear one, where you start somewhere and you have flash forwards or flashbacks. And just playing with that timeline and the elasticity of that can completely reimagine the way a situation is considered.
And I think that particular example I mentioned in terms of the save files with our OHS, the case of the exploding turbo encabulator, it followed a non-linear structure and started at the end with an explosion and then led through an investigation that stepped forward in time but also went backwards to look at the different events. And I suppose one of the things that made that a more engaging approach rather than following a very sequential linear forward chronology where you had someone not tighten a nut while they were doing maintenance, to then not do a checklist, to then not to be distracted while they were doing a safety thing, to then have it explode. It gives you tension and I suppose a different purpose for the characters to uncover what's actually happened and where it leads. And B, I don't know whether you want to talk a little bit about any examples as we go through these.
Probably not. I'm just thinking about the time, Cam, and we really probably want to get to the end.
Yeah, sure.
Section. And this is really just stepping through. These slides will be made available to you. The terminology there you can look up on. You can Google it. We'll also provide some references. But it's just this, just trying to plant that seed that when you're thinking about story, thinking about chronology can completely and utterly transform something from being really straightforward to really challenging learners and engaging them in the story that you're telling. And the other one is a reverse one, tell the story from back to front. I mean, play around with these things. I've included this slide mainly because in digital learning, it's very hard to tell, we're not making TV necessarily. We might use video, but often, the videos are segmented throughout, the wider piece of learning. So you can actually have these storytelling elements which build on one another, or they could be episodic, or they could be all kinds of little, mini stories, or they're building, chapters building into a whole. And interspersed, sorry, the squeaking's my puppy. Meg, stop it. But interspersed with what clients often want, which is more informative pieces. They want a formative assessment, or they want you to go out to a link. They want you to read a definition. It's not always the coolest thing to do, but it doesn't mean it has to be uncool. You can still build through really effective narratives using this particular model.
Yeah, and there are ways to include those artifacts and the essence of what clients are after as artifacts in the world of the story. And I think that becomes a really powerful way of not jarring the audience, by saying, well, here's this really great narrative that you're engaged with, and you're hooked on what's going to happen to our main character. Now look at this page of a checklist, of things that you should be doing. Yeah, but if one of those characters had been handed that and said, hey, this is something you should review.
Well, it can be really difficult to take learners to get clients on that journey to embed everything, but you can actually put your documents in because of the power of the digital, the connectivity of the digital. If they have to read a definition, make it part of the story and link out to it and make it look like an artifact that is just a peephole into it. And finally, probably in this thing, is the weft and weave model. This is probably, when we're talking about, something you watch on Netflix, everything is interwoven. This is where you tell an immersive story from start to finish. And there's not these moments where you take the learner out into these, learning artifacts, but it's actually the knowledge is all embedded just as an intrinsic part of the story.
And you see this a lot with documentaries and, and that style of storytelling where, they deep dive into, really key information that's actually just part of the story.
Yeah. And I think we just need to keep moving, Cam, because
I think so too.
The other thing maybe just briefly touch upon it. We're talking about narrative models for content delivery, but I think part of our conversations that Cam and I have had is that narrative can actually form part of your solution design process as well.
Yeah.
So really briefly about that, Cam.
Yeah, Aaron talked a little bit this morning, or quite extensively this morning, about design thinking, and one of the techniques that he uses when he's conducting interviews is asking his audience to tell them about a time when they did X or Y, and I think that's a really great way of starting to use story as a part of the process, not just as a part of the outcome. But there are other things. So human-centered design largely builds on the idea of characters and journeys, and understanding those characters through empathy maps and what they're capable of, how they would respond to a particular challenge, what they would say, think, and do.
Can I just interject there? I think the interesting thing about this idea about creating, learner personas or archetypes is actually the same techniques you might use for developing those is actually the same process as what you can use to develop characters should you be doing something more fictional. So you're drawing on real people and building them up, their characteristics, and doing those little background things that you can then include in your story. So your characters are fully rounded, and they'll react authentically to situations that you throw at them. So if given a story, they've got a conflict, how would that particular persona respond to it as opposed to a different persona? So that's something you can use.
And for me, the idea of using human-centered design, it really gives you the groundwork for employing stories if you want to employ stories. But if you don't, you've still got a story written for your key audience. And knowing that, you can then identify those predicaments that they're getting themselves into and how you help them extricate themselves out of that through a just-in-time tool. Maybe it's a poster on the wall reminding them of some particular conduct or information. But having the broader context, that broader story for your audience, can really help to pinpoint those areas as well.
I think we probably can't dwell on this part too much. We wanted to talk about it more, but creating really authentic characters and doing that groundwork to begin with, it will completely enrich a story. I mean, a lot of in scenario-based learning, it's like, Jenny's at the cafe and the customer's rude to her. How does she respond? Well, unless we actually know more about Jenny and her background and how she sees the world, we can't really generate an authentic response. Not that there's an opportunity in scenario-based learning, but if you're doing more immersive narrative work, really start with your character. So I think we can actually even skip through, because I think that was what we were going to talk about in terms of creative techniques.
Yeah, it is. There's probably 3 areas that are worth looking at. In addition, agile planning methodologies. So the idea of epics, user stories and tasks follow a really similar methodology, but it's used for documenting things that you're going to build or things that that need exploration or that you're going to implement, and using XAPI or activity streams as a data capture mechanism follows a lot of story methodologies where they've got a character and they've got an action and they've got an object and context that they're applying. So when you talk about story in our lives as designers, not just in our lives as a medium, it's everywhere, and I think it's already in a lot of the work that people are doing, but certainly worth exploring more.
So
I've just got a question for the audience, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Sorry, Hannah. We've kind of been rushing through that.
But we're just wanting to know, so you spoke about case files, which is compliance. We're wondering if you had an example of this in a non-linear format.
What I'll probably just jump in and say right there and then is that anything you see or watch on, say, Netflix, or any stories that you read, any of those models can be applied to a learning scenario or a learning story. So we can talk about particular, because we can't really show you any of our work because it's proprietary. Think about any story you've seen on TV that has a flash forward to a certain event. I mean, for example, I'm just going to say, Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad has episodes that begin with what happens at the end of the story. So the plane crashes, for example. I'm not sure if anyone's seen the episode, but the plane crashes and they show all the sort of you don't know the planes crash. You just see these remnants of things in the pool. Then the story proceeds and then the story flashes back and then you hear about, there was a plane crash. So that's why there were things in the pool. The methodology doesn't change no matter whether it's for, TV, screenwriting or, learning narratives. All these techniques are transposable and applicable, which is why it's really, really important, if you're interested in using story in your learning design, that you watch as much as you can, you read as much as you can, you look at things like, how characters developed, you look at points of view. Is it first person? First person is like very intimate, like it's, like a memoir, it's like a diary. You could use, second person, to be more dynamic and put the learner in, someone else's shoes. Choose your own adventure. Branching narratives are often a classic example of that. You did this, you saw that, what do you do? Or, third person, which is that omniscient narrative, which is, you remove the learner from the learning, which is, a different thing again.
Yeah. I think one of the, sorry, go on.
I just wanted to, move into the importance, when you're playing around with, storytelling techniques, is looking at different genres you could use. If you've got a particular problem or story you want to tell, what's the best genre for it? Is it like a crime, law and order crime procedural? Is it a whodunit or a mockumentary? Does it, could comedy just bring a whole new?
Well, and don't feel. I think it. The thing also is not to feel like you need to reinvent the wheel. We're often working on shoestring budgets with very, very demanding timelines. So picking the essence of what you want to achieve and then looking for examples of that out in the world. The save files that we mentioned, we leveraged some of the key characters out of Dexter because they epitomized what we were looking for in a female lead,
Well, you're talking about that particular example, which people might not be familiar with, but, it was basically Law and Order reimagined with characters from Dexter. So the thing is, creativity doesn't have to be expensive. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Draw on things that you see and analyze them. Looking at some of those, storytelling frameworks. What devices are they using? And what would happen in telling your own story if you came up with one and, if you mapped it out visually as a linear narrative versus playing around with chronology and making a non-linear one or telling it in reverse? What happens if you changed your point of view? What happens if it became a converging narrative? I mean, I think looking at stuff in the real world, analyzing it, breaking it down, will really, you can then start to apply those things to your own process.
Yeah, and we've got a few exercises there, taking the structures that we've shown and dissecting anything that you're watching, any story, any narrative, and identifying the structure firstly and then mapping it out will help you understand how you can use it yourself.
Probably Hannah, looking at the time, are there any questions?
I just didn't want to interrupt.
No, go for it.
Thank you so much, Cameron and Bianca. It's been incredible to have you, and we've definitely learned a lot, and I know the audience has as well. So thank you so much for being at the Learning Conference, and hang tight, everyone. The next session is coming up very soon.